The letter had been folded so many times its edges were soft as velvet, and Cowboy Mark Tesoro knew every crease by heart. 23 years he'd carried it in his breast pocket, close enough to feel the papers whisper against his ribs with each breath. The words inside were burned into his memory like a brand on cowhide, but he'd never found the courage to deliver them. Mark stood at the edge of Willow Creek Ranch, watching the morning mist rise from the pasture like the ghosts of all his yesterdays. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he pulled the letter from his pocket once more, unfolding it with the reverence of a man handling sacred scripture. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but Cordelia Brightwater's elegant script remained legible. My dearest Mark, if you're reading this, then I've found the strength to tell you what my heart has held prisoner for so long. He'd been 18 when she'd pressed this letter into his palm during the harvest dance of 1852, her eyes bright with tears and hope. But before he could read it, before he could understand the weight of her words, the war had called him away. 3 years of cannon smoke and blood had passed before he returned to find Cordelia married to banker Quinton Mallory, her dreams apparently settled into respectability. Mark had tried to return the letter then, standing on her front porch with his head in his hands and his heart in his throat. But Cordelia had stepped back as if his presence burned her face pale as winter frost. Keep it, she'd whispered. Maybe someday. She'd never finished that sentence, and he'd never found the courage to ask what someday meant. Now, at 41, Mark wondered if someday would ever come. Cordelia lived just 30 miles east in Copper Valley, married still to Mallory, mother to 3 children he'd heard tell of but never seen. The letter had become his constant companion through cattle drives and lonely winters, through towns that all looked the same and saloons that never quite washed away the taste of regret. A whinny from the corral broke his reverie. Thunder, his black stallion, stood at the fence with his ears pricked forward, as if sensing his master's turmoil. The horse had been Mark's partner for 8 years now, a wild Mustang he'd gentled with patience rather than force. Thunder understood him in ways most people never had, the way his shoulders set when storm clouds gathered, the way his breathing changed when memories grew too heavy. Mark folded the letter carefully and returned it to his pocket. Today was like any other day, he told himself. He had cattle to move, fences to mend, a life to live that had learned to exist around the shape of this one unspoken truth. He whistled for Thunder, who trotted over with the easy grace that had made him legendary in 3 counties. As Mark saddled his horse, he noticed something different in Thunder's demeanor. The stallion kept looking east, toward the mountains that separated Willow Creek from Copper Valley. His nostrils flared as if catching a scent carried on the wind, and his muscles quivered with an energy that had nothing to do with the morning chill. What is it, boy? Mark murmured, running his hand along Thunder's neck. The horse turned to look at him with those intelligent dark eyes, and for a moment, Mark could have sworn he saw something almost human in their depths, a kind of understanding that went beyond the usual bond between man and beast. Thunder stamped his hooves and tossed his head toward the eastern trail, the one that led through Devil's Canyon and down into Copper Valley, the one Mark had ridden 1,000 times in his dreams, but never in daylight. The morning sun climbed higher as Mark finished his usual chores, but Thunder's restlessness only grew. The stallion paced the length of his paddock, stopping periodically to stare toward the eastern mountains with an intensity that made Mark's chest tighten with unnamed possibility. By noon, Thunder had worked himself into such a state that he'd rubbed a raw patch on his neck from pressing against the fence rails. All right, boy, Mark finally conceded, approaching with Thunder's bridle. You want to head east so badly. We'll take a ride. He'd planned to check the water holes on the western range, but Thunder's behavior had unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. 23 years of carrying another man's wife's letter had taught him to recognize the signs when fate was stirring. They rode out under a sky so blue it hurt to look at, Thunder's hooves eating up the miles with purposeful strides. The trail to Devil's Canyon was treacherous, winding through granite outcroppings and stands of pine that seemed to whisper secrets in the mountain wind. Mark had ridden it only once before, shortly after returning from the war, when the letter was still new and his hope still tender. He'd turned back that day, convincing himself he was respecting Cordelia's marriage, but knowing in his heart he was simply afraid. Halfway through the canyon, Thunder suddenly veered off the main trail, following a narrow deer path that Mark didn't recognize. "Where you taking us, partner?" Mark asked, but he didn't pull the reins. Something in Thunder's manner, confident, almost urgent, suggested the horse knew exactly where he was going. The path wound down, through a grove of aspens whose leaves trembled like golden coins. In the breeze, Mark heard water running nearby, and caught glimpses of a creek through the trees. Then the path opened into a meadow so perfect it might have been painted by angels, and Mark's breath caught in his throat. There, beside the creek, sat a woman on a bay mare. Even from a distance, even after 23 years, he would have known that silhouette anywhere. Cordelia Brightwater, no. Cordelia Mallory now sat with her back straight and her hands folded over the saddle horn, as if she'd been waiting for centuries. Thunder whickered softly and picked up his pace, approaching the woman and her horse with the familiarity of old friends. Mark wanted to call out, to turn around, to do anything but continue this collision with destiny. But his voice had abandoned him somewhere between recognition and disbelief. Cordelia turned at their approach, and Mark saw that time had been both kind and cruel to her. Her hair was still the color of autumn leaves, though silver threads caught the sunlight now. Her face bore the lines that came from raising children and managing a household. But her eyes, those green eyes that had haunted his dreams, were exactly as he remembered them. "Hello, Mark," she said simply, as if they'd parted yesterday instead of decades ago. Cordelia. Her name felt foreign on his tongue, too precious to speak aloud. How did you?" She smiled, and it was like sunrise after the longest night. "Duchess brought me here," she said, patting her mare's neck. 3 days running now. She's refused to go anywhere but this direction. This morning she wouldn't even let me dismount until we reached this exact spot." She paused, studying his face with an expression he couldn't read. "I had the strangest feeling I was supposed to wait." Thunder moved closer to Duchess, and the two horses touched noses in greeting. Mark watched in amazement as his stallion, who was typically standoffish with other horses, nuzzled the mare with gentle affection. "They know each other," Cordelia observed, wonder in her voice. Mark's hand moved unconsciously to his breast pocket, feeling the familiar outline of the letter. "Cordelia, you kept it," she said softly, her eyes following his gesture. "All these years, you kept it." He nodded, unable to trust his voice. The letter suddenly felt heavier than lead, more dangerous than dynamite. "I never should have given it to you," she continued, her voice barely audible over the creek's gentle babbling. "It wasn't fair to burden you with words I should have spoken aloud." Thunder stepped forward then, closing the distance between the two riders until Mark could have reached out and touched Cordelia's hand. The stallion's movement seemed deliberate, purposeful, as if he were trying to push them together. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither dared to cross, filled only by the creek's gentle murmur and the soft breathing of their horses. Mark studied Cordelia's face, searching for some sign of what she was thinking, what she wanted, what this impossible meeting might mean. The letter in his pocket seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, demanding to be acknowledged. "Your children," Mark finally managed, grasping for safe ground. "I heard, 3 of them?" Cordelia's face softened with maternal pride, and something else. Was it sadness? "Yes. Beaumont is 19 now, working at his father's bank. Magnolia is 16. Beautiful and headstrong as a wild filly, and little Jasper just turned 12. She paused, her fingers tightening on the reins. "They're good children, Mark. I've been blessed." The word blessed hung in the air between them, and Mark heard everything she didn't say. A blessed life, a respectable marriage, a future secured by duty rather than desire. He'd wondered, during the long nights on cattle drives, whether she'd found happiness with Quinton Mallory. Now, looking into her eyes, he thought he had his answer. Thunder suddenly stepped forward again, this time positioning himself so close to Duchess that Mark's leg brushed against Cordelia's skirt. The contact sent electricity through him, and he saw her sharp intake of breath. For a moment, the years collapsed, and they were 18 again, dancing at the harvest festival with her hand warm in his, and the whole world spread before them, like an unwritten story. "He's remarkable," Cordelia said, reaching out to stroke Thunder's neck. "I've never seen a horse with such presence. It's as if he understands things beyond the ordinary." Mark watched her fingers trace patterns in Thunder's dark coat. Found him as a yearling, all torn up from a mountain cat. Spent weeks nursing him back to health, expecting him to run off the moment he was strong enough. But he stayed. "Been my partner ever since, and he brought you here today," she observed, her eyes meeting his over Thunder's neck, "just as Duchess brought me." The implication hung between them, too profound to ignore. Mark had heard stories of horses with unusual abilities, animals that seemed to possess an almost supernatural understanding of human affairs. Old-timers spoke of messenger horses during the war, steeds that could find their way across battlefields to deliver crucial intelligence. But this felt different, more intimate, as if Thunder and Duchess were conspiring to right an old wrong. "Cordelia," Mark began, then stopped. How could he explain 23 years of carrying her words next to his heart? How could he tell her that he'd built his entire life around the shape of her absence? She seemed to understand his struggle. "May I see it?" she asked quietly. "The letter?" With trembling hands, Mark withdrew the worn paper from his pocket. The fold lines had become so soft they were barely visible, and the edges were rounded. From countless handlings, he held it out to her, and she accepted it with the reverence of someone receiving a sacred relic. Cordelia unfolded the letter carefully, her eyes scanning words she'd written in another lifetime. As she read, Mark watched her face transform, cycling through emotions he could barely name: regret, longing, sorrow, and something that might have been hope. "I was so young," she whispered finally, "so naive to think that love alone could overcome everything: duty, family expectations, the way the world works." She looked up at him, tears gathering in her eyes. "I told you in this letter that I would wait for you, that nothing could change what I felt. But when you didn't come back, I came back," Mark said, his voice rough with old pain. "I came back as soon as the war ended, but you were already married. Quinton proposed 6 months after you left," she said, her voice barely audible. "My father said it was a good match, that I couldn't wait forever for a cowboy who might never return. I thought if you truly loved me, you would have written, would have sent word somehow." Mark felt the familiar stab of regret that had been his companion for 2 decades. "I tried to write 100 times, but what could I say? I was fighting a war, living day to day, never knowing if I'd see another sunrise. I didn't want to make promises I might not live to keep." Thunder shifted beneath him, and Mark realized the horse was trembling not with cold or fear, but with an energy that seemed almost electrical. Duchess, too, appeared agitated. Her ears pricked forward as if she were listening to something beyond human hearing. "They feel it too," Cordelia said wonderingly. "This moment, this choice hanging between us like a storm about to break." Mark looked into her eyes and saw his own longing reflected there, as bright and desperate as it had been 23 years ago. The letter in her hands seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight, as if the words themselves were finally ready to be spoken aloud. A sudden gust of wind swept through the meadow, and the letter in Cordelia's hands fluttered like a captive bird. Trying to escape, she gripped it tighter, her knuckles white against the faded paper. But Thunder chose that moment to toss his head, startling her. The letter slipped from her fingers and sailed through the air, carried by the wind toward the creek. "No," Mark lunged forward, but the letter was already dancing just out of reach, tumbling end over end toward the water that would destroy 23 years of preserved hope. In a matter of seconds, Thunder exploded into motion with a speed that took Mark's breath away. The stallion leaped forward, his powerful haunches propelling them both toward the creek with the fluid grace of a mountain cat. Mark felt himself lifting from the saddle as Thunder stretched his neck out impossibly far, his teeth closing gently round the corner of the letter just inches. Before it would have touched the water dot, the horse landed with surprising delicacy, his hooves finding secure footing on the creek bank. He turned his head toward Mark, the letter held carefully in his mouth like a precious gift, his dark eyes bright with what could only be described as satisfaction. Thunder, Mark breathed, reaching for the letter with shaking hands. How did you? But before he could complete the thought, Thunder did something extraordinary. Instead of giving the letter to Mark, the horse turned and walked deliberately back to Cordelia, stopping directly in front of her bay mare. He lifted his head and held the letter out to her, waiting with the patience of a creature who understood the weight of the moment. Cordelia's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the letter from Thunder's gentle mouth. He saved it, she whispered. He saved our words. Mark dismounted and walked to stand beside Thunder, one hand resting on the horse's powerful neck. The stallion's coat was warm beneath his palm, and he could feel the animal's heart beating, steady and strong, as if this act of rescue had cost him nothing more than a moment's effort. Our words, Mark repeated softly. He looked at Cordelia, still mounted on Duchess, the rescued letter clutched against her chest. But what do they mean now, after all this time? You have a life, a family, responsibilities I have no right to interfere with. Cordelia closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, Mark saw a determination there that reminded him powerfully of the girl who had pressed this letter into his hands all those years ago. Quinton died last winter, she said quietly. Pneumonia. Took him in February. He was a good man, Mark, a kind husband and father. I mourned him properly, and I'll always be grateful for the life he gave me. But, she paused, looking down at the letter, then back at Mark. But I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day in 23 years. I told myself it was foolish. That love like that was something for young people and fairy tales. But when Duchess started bringing me here, when she refused to go anywhere else, I began to wonder if maybe what? Mark asked, though his heart was already answering the question. If maybe some things are worth waiting for, no matter how long it takes. Thunder moved then, stepping away from the creek to position himself between Mark and Cordelia, as if he were a minister about to perform a ceremony. Duchess followed, moving to stand parallel to Thunder so that Mark and Cordelia faced each other, across the small space between the horses. Read it, Mark said, nodding toward the letter. Read it aloud. I want to hear the words I should have heard 23 years ago. Cordelia's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter once more. The paper was slightly damp now from Thunder's rescue, but the ink remained clear. She cleared her throat and began to read in a voice that carried across the meadow like a prayer. My dearest Mark, if you're reading this, then I've found the strength to tell you what my heart has held prisoner for so long. I love you with a love that frightens me in its completeness. When I close my eyes, I see your face. When I dream of the life we could build together. Wild and free as the horses you gentle with such patience. Her voice broke slightly, but she continued, I know the world says we're too different, that a banker's daughter has no business loving a cowboy. But the world doesn't know how you make me laugh, how safe I feel in your arms, how you see beauty in things others overlook. If you'll have me, I'll follow you anywhere. If you'll wait for me, I'll find a way to come to you. All I ask is that you give me a sign that this love isn't one-sided, that somewhere in your heart, you carry the same hope I carry in mine. The meadow fell silent except for the gentle sound of water over stones, and the soft breathing of for souls to human, to equine suspended in a moment that had been 23 years in the making. Mark felt the world tilt on its axis as Cordelia's words settled into the meadow air like morning dew. 23 years of wondering, of careful distance, of building his life around the absence of this woman, and now here she was, reading him the promise she'd made when they were both young enough to believe love could conquer everything. A sign, he repeated softly, his voice hoarse with emotion. You asked for a sign. Thunder shifted beneath his hand, and Mark looked down to find the stallion watching him with those impossibly intelligent eyes. The horse nickered softly, then did something Mark had never seen him do before. He bowed his great head, lowering it until his muzzle nearly touched the ground in what could only be described as reverence. Duchess followed suit, dipping her head in the same graceful gesture, and for a moment, the two horses created a natural arch between Mark and Cordelia, their necks forming the shape of a heart. Against the backdrop of the mountain meadow, my God, Cordelia whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. They're blessing us. Mark stepped forward, closing the distance between them until he could reach up and take Cordelia's hand. Her fingers were cool from the mountain air, but warmed instantly in his grasp. "The sign you asked for," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Maybe it wasn't meant to come from me at all. Maybe it was meant to come from them." Mark smiled at being called Pa. The title had come naturally to Jasper within weeks of the wedding, though Beaumont and Magnolia had needed more time to accept their mother's new husband. Beaumont was thriving in Denver, his letters full of excitement about city banking and a young woman named Clementine who had caught his eye. Magnolia had indeed gone to San Francisco for teachers' college, and her letters painted pictures of a world so vast and full of possibility that Mark sometimes worried she'd never come back to their little valley. But she would, he knew. Some souls were meant for grand adventures, but home always called them back eventually. Cordelia looked up from her tomato plants and caught him watching her. Even after 6 months of marriage, the sight of her still made his heart skip like a schoolboy's. She'd taken to ranch life with surprising grace, though she insisted on maintaining certain civilized touches: lace curtains in the windows, wildflowers on the kitchen table, and a library of books that was quickly becoming the envy of the neighboring ranchers' wives. What are you thinking about?" she called out, wiping dirt from her hands on her apron. "Just remembering," Mark replied, stepping down from the porch to join her in the garden. "Seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once." Cordelia leaned into his embrace, and Mark marveled again at how perfectly she fit against his side, as if they'd been designed as to halves of the same whole. "Do you ever wonder about them?" she asked, nodding toward the pasture where Thunder and Duchess grazed side by side. "About what they really are." Mark followed her gaze to their horses, who seemed to be engaged in their own quiet conversation. In the months since their wedding, he'd witnessed dozens of small miracles: Thunder finding lost cattle in impossible places, Duchess somehow knowing when neighbors needed help. Even before the neighbors knew it themselves, the other ranchers had begun to speak of Mark's horses in hushed, reverent tones, and more than one had suggested that Thunder and Duchess possessed abilities that went far beyond ordinary horse sense. "I think," Mark said slowly, "that some questions aren't meant to be answered. Some gifts are meant to be accepted with gratitude and wonder, not picked apart with logic." As if responding to his words, Thunder raised his head and looked directly at them. The stallion's dark eyes held that familiar intelligence, that depth of understanding that had guided Mark through the most important day of his life. Thunder nickered softly, and Duchess joined him, their voices harmonizing in a sound that seemed to carry blessings on the evening breeze. "Papa," Jasper called out, his voice bright with excitement. "I did it. I roped the post 3 times in a row." Mark and Cordelia hurried over to the corral, where Jasper was practically bouncing with pride. Thunder stood beside the boy, his head high and his eyes bright with what could only be described as paternal approval. "That's fine work, son," Mark said, and he meant it. The boy had natural talent, the kind that couldn't be taught, only nurtured. "Thunder seems to think so too." As if to confirm Mark's words, Thunder stepped forward and gently nuzzled Jasper's shoulder, the same gesture of affection he'd once reserved only for Mark. The boy giggled and wrapped his arms around the horse's powerful neck, and Mark felt his throat tighten with emotion. "This," he thought, "this is what the letter was really about. Not just love between a man and a woman, but love that expands to embrace family, community, a whole way of life." Cordelia had written about following him anywhere, but what she'd really been offering was the chance to build something together, something bigger and more lasting than either of them could create alone. That night, after Jasper had gone to bed and the evening chores were done, Mark and Cordelia sat on their front porch, watching stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. Thunder and Duchess stood at the fence nearby, silhouetted against the starlight like guardians keeping watch. "No regrets?" Mark asked, taking Cordelia's hand in his. "Only one," she said, surprising him. He turned to look at her, concerned, but she was smiling. "I regret that we were too young and foolish to trust in what we had 23 years ago. Think of all the sunsets we could have watched together." Mark squeezed her hand. "Maybe we weren't ready then. Maybe we needed those years apart to become the people we are now." The people who could appreciate this second chance. Maybe Thunder and Duchess knew that. Cordelia said softly. Maybe they were waiting for the right moment, when we were finally ready to receive the gift they wanted to give us. As if summoned by her words, both horses turned toward the porch in the starlight. Mark could see their eyes glowing with that familiar otherworldly radiance, and for just a moment, he glimpsed again the truth he'd seen in the meadow. These weren't just horses, but something far more magnificent. Creatures of purpose and power who had chosen to take equine form to fulfill a destiny that spanned decades. Thunder whinnied once, a sound that seemed to carry across the valley and into the mountains beyond. He gestured toward Thunder and Duchess, who had maintained their ceremonial pose as if they understood the gravity of the moment. 23 years, Cordelia. 23 years they waited to bring us together. How is that possible unless— He paused, hardly daring to voice the thought. Unless some force in this universe knew we belonged together. Cordelia dismounted gracefully, never letting go of Mark's hand, standing beside him in the meadow. She seemed both exactly as he remembered and wonderfully changed by the years. The girl who had given him the letter was still there in her eyes, but she was enhanced now by the wisdom of a woman who had lived, loved, suffered, and survived. I used to wonder, she said, during the long nights when Quinton was traveling for the bank, when the children were sleeping and the house was quiet. I used to wonder what you were doing under the same stars, whether you ever thought of me, whether you ever regretted not reading the letter before you left. I regretted it every day, Mark admitted, but I was 18 and scared, and going off to war seemed like the most important thing in the world. I thought I'd come back in a few months, that we'd have all the time we needed to figure out our future. I never imagined that time would become our enemy instead of our friend. Cordelia finished. Thunder raised his head and moved closer, gently nudging Mark's shoulder with his nose. When Mark turned to look at him, the horse whickered softly and nodded toward Cordelia, as if urging him to action. He's impatient, Mark said with a laugh that held to decades of pent-up joy. I think he's tired of waiting for me to do what I should have done 23 years ago. Mark released Cordelia's hand and stepped back, then slowly, deliberately, sank to one knee in the soft grass of the meadow. Cordelia's breath caught, her hand flying to her throat, and Mark saw tears begin to slide down her cheeks. I don't have a ring, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. I don't have much of anything except a horse, a small ranch, and a heart that's belonged to you since I was 18 years old. But if you'll have me, Cordelia, if you'll take a chance on a cowboy who's learned that some things are worth waiting for no matter how long it takes, I promise you this, I'll spend every remaining day of my life making up for the 23 years we lost. Cordelia was crying openly now, but her smile was radiant as sunrise. Mark Tesoro, she said, her voice shaking with laughter and tears. Are you proposing to me in a meadow with our horses as witnesses? I am, he said firmly, and I'm asking Thunder and Duchess to hold us accountable if we ever take each other for granted again. Both horses whinnied at the same time, a sound of pure joy that echoed off the mountain walls and sent a family of deer bounding away through the aspens. Cordelia laughed and held out her hands to Mark, pulling him to his feet. Then yes, she said, stepping into his arms as naturally as if she'd been doing it every day for 23 years. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. Mark kissed her then, finally, in the golden light of late afternoon, while Thunder and Duchess stood guard around them like four-legged angels. The letter fluttered to the ground, forgotten at last, its purpose finally fulfilled. When they broke apart, both breathless, Cordelia rested her forehead against Mark's chest. What will people say? She asked, a widow of 6 months running off with a cowboy. Let them talk, Mark said, tightening his arms around her. We've wasted enough time worrying about what other people think. Thunder moved close again, and this time Duchess joined him, the two horses creating a protective circle round the reunited lovers. Mark looked into their eyes and saw something that made his heart race with possibility, not just love, but destiny, as if this moment had been written in the stars long before any of them were born. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the meadow in shades of gold and amber, Mark and Cordelia found themselves reluctant to leave the sacred space, where their future had finally begun. They sat together on a fallen log beside the creek, Cordelia's head resting on Mark's shoulder while Thunder and Duchess grazed nearby, their movements synchronized like dancers who had rehearsed together for years. "I keep expecting to wake up," Cordelia murmured, her fingers tracing patterns on Mark's weathered hand. 23 years of dreams, and none of them were as perfect as this moment. Mark pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, lavender and sunshine, exactly as he remembered. "We need to talk about the practical things," he said gently. "Your children, your life in Copper Valley. I won't ask you to abandon everything for me." Cordelia sat up to look at him, her green eyes serious. "Beaumont is practically a man already, and he's been talking about striking out on his own anyway. The bank position in Denver that his father arranged for him, maybe it's time he took it." She paused, considering. Magnolia has been chafing against Copper Valley's restrictions for months. She keeps talking about the teaching college in San Francisco, how she wants to see the world beyond our little valley. "And Jasper?" Mark asked. Softly, Cordelia's face lit up with maternal pride. "Jasper is like you were at that age, wild as a Mustang colt and twice as stubborn. He's been begging me to let him spend summers working on a cattle ranch ever since his father died. Said town life is suffocating him." She laughed, a sound like silver bells on the wind. "I think he'd be thrilled to have a stepfather who could teach him to rope and ride properly." Thunder looked up from his grazing, ears pricked forward as if he'd been listening to their conversation. He walked over to them with that purposeful stride Mark had learned to recognize, stopping directly in front of the log where they sat. "What is it, boy?" Mark asked, reaching out to stroke the stallion's neck. Thunder turned his head toward the east, toward the trail that led back to Copper Valley, then looked back at Mark with an expression that was unmistakably urgent. "He's telling us it's time to go," Cordelia said with wonder. "He brought us together, and now he's ready to take us home." Mark stood and helped Cordelia to her feet, reluctant to break the spell of their magical afternoon, but understanding that their real life, together, was waiting somewhere beyond this meadow. As they walked toward their horses, he noticed something strange. Duchess was standing beside Thunder's saddle, her reins somehow tangled with his tack in a way that would make it impossible for them to separate without human intervention. "How did," Mark began, then stopped. He was beginning to accept that Thunder and Duchess operated by rules that transcended ordinary horse behavior. "They're telling us we ride together from now on," Cordelia said with a laugh. "No more going our separate ways." As Mark worked to untangle the reins, he found they weren't tangled at all. They were braided together in an intricate pattern that would have taken human hands considerable time and skill to create. He looked at Thunder, who gazed back with eyes that held depths Mark was only beginning to fathom. "Thunder," he said quietly, "what are you?" The horse nickered softly and nuzzled Mark's shoulder, then did something that made Cordelia gasp in amazement. Thunder began to glow, not with visible light, but with something deeper, a radiance that seemed to emanate from his very soul. Duchess joined him, and for a moment, the two horses stood bathed in an ethereal luminescence that made them appear almost otherworldly. "They're not just horses," Cordelia whispered, her voice filled with awe. "They're guardians, angels." The light faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Thunder and Duchess looking like perfectly ordinary horses once more. But Mark felt a profound shift in his understanding of the world, as if he'd been granted a glimpse behind the curtain of reality and seen the invisible forces that guide human destiny. They mounted their horses, Mark on Thunder, Cordelia on Duchess, and began the journey back toward Copper Valley. But instead of riding side by side, the horses maintained a formation that kept them close enough to touch, close enough to talk, close enough to begin planning the life they would build together. As they reached the canyon's entrance, Mark turned for one last look at the meadow where his life had changed forever. The setting sun had turned the grass to gold, and he could have sworn he saw other figures, their shadowy forms of horses and riders from long ago. All the couples who had been brought together by forces beyond their understanding, all the love stories that had played out in that sacred space. Thunder whinnied once, a sound that echoed off the canyon walls like a promise. And then they were riding toward their future, to people and to extraordinary horses, finally complete after 23 years of waiting. The letter lay forgotten in the meadow grass, but it didn't matter anymore. The words had been spoken, the promise kept, and love had found a way. 6 months later, Mark stood on the front porch of the house he'd built with his own hands, watching Cordelia tend to her vegetable garden while Jasper worked with Thunder in the nearby corral. The boy had taken to ranch life like a duck to water, and Thunder seemed to sense that this 12-year-old was someone special, someone worth the patience he'd once shown a wounded yearling. "Easy, Thunder," Jasper called out, his voice cracking with adolescence as he attempted to throw a lasso round a practice post. "Pa says you gotta feel the rope, not fight it."